Welcome back. We are reading Living with Art, the 11th edition by Mark Getlein. We were on chapter 4. This is chapter 4, part 2, I guess you would say. And we're going to start out with texture and pattern. Texture refers to a quality. Texture refers to. I'm starting off bad already. I'm sorry, guys. Here we go. Texture refers to surface quality, a perception of smooth or rough, flat or bumpy, fine or coarse. Our world would be bland and uninteresting without contrast of texture. Most of us, when we encounter a dog or cat, are moved to pet the animal, partly because the animal likes it, but also because we enjoy the feel of the fur's texture against our hands. In planning our clothes, we instinctively take texture into account. We might put on a thick, nubby sweater over a smooth cotton shirt and enjoy the contrast. We look for this textural interest in all facets of our environment. Few people can resist running their hands over a smooth chunk of marble or a glossy length of silk or a drape of velvet. This is the outstanding feature of texture. It makes us want to touch it. Actual texture. Actual texture is literally tactile, a quality we could experience through touch. It would be a pleasure to run our hands along the smooth industrial surface around the perimeter of Mona Houghton's still dormiente, but anyone who has ever scraped their knuckles on a kitchen grater would be very careful about exploring the rough texture of the two central fields. Dormiente is Italian for a sleeping person. The title asks us to imagine this large-scale grater as a bed, thus encouraging us to contemplate the exact experience we would rather not consider, the intimate contact of our vulnerable flesh with its jagged metal protrusions. In my work, I often take familiar everyday things and make them unfamiliar, reveal the uncanny to them, in them, Houghton says. I like it when something is simultaneously attractive and forbidding, both seductive and dangerous. Like any other element, visual element, texture can contribute to our understanding and interpretation of a work. Constantine Brancusi patiently polished his marble sculptures to a smooth finish and his bronze works to a brilliant shine. The wooden bases he carved to support them, however, he usually left in a rougher, less finished state. On the base, on the base here, gouges from his chisel. On the base here, gouges from his chisel can still be seen. The base supports three geometric elements: a rectangular prism of wood, a cross-shaped prism of limestone, and a polished white marble cylinder. At each step, the texture grows smoother and more refined, like an idea taking shape and becoming increasingly precise. Visual texture. That we can appreciate the texture of Houghton's Dormiente or Brancusi's Blonde Negress 2 in a photograph shows that texture has a visual component as well as a tactile one. In fact, even before touching a surface, we have formed an idea of its texture by observing the way it reflects light and associating what we see with a sense memory of touch. Brancusi's use of texture can thus be significant for us, even though we would certainly not be permitted to touch the sculpture in a museum. And Houghton's use of texture can give us a deeply unsettling visual experience, even if we do not run our hand over the dormiente. Naturalistic painting can suggest the texture of objects in the world in the same way that photography does. By faithfully recording the way light plays over their surfaces, centuries before photography was invented, Dutch still life painter delighted in capturing visual texture in paint, and no one was better at it than William Caff. Notice here how reflected light conveys the hard, smooth surface of the glazed porcelain bowl, and shadow captures the minutely pitted skin of the lemon and the soft, tufted texture of the rug. Our word texture is derived from the Latin textus, the past participle of texture, textere, to weave. It is easy to imagine how the experience of appreciating woven cloth by touching it was transferred to the experience of touching surfaces in general. In addition to its literal meaning, we have also come to use the word figuratively in a variety of ways, often for things we can imagine as woven. For example, we could describe a poem as woven of words, a symphony as woven of notes played by many instruments, and a painting as woven of brushstrokes. In each case, we can speak of the work's texture, oral texture for the poem and the symphony, visual texture for the painting. Earlier in this chapter, we spoke of the lively texture produced by Seurat's pointillist technique, for the dots seem to weave a tapestry of color. Paintings by Van Gogh have a characteristic visual texture created by the typically short, unblended brushstrokes. Pattern. Pattern is any decorative, repetitive motif or design. Pattern can create visual texture, although visual texture may not always be seen as a pattern. An interesting aspect of pattern is that it tends to flatten our perception of mass and space. The self-portrait here by African photographer Samuel Fosso illustrates the visual buzz and spatial ambiguity that patterns can produce. Everything clamors for our attention at once. Elements that should stay calm in the background or firmly underfoot seem to come forward to meet us. In the middle of it all sits the artist, dressed as an outrageous parody of a traditional ruler. For an example of the sort of royal display that Fosso is mocking, see 18.12. Space. The word space, especially in our technological world, sometimes conveys the idea of nothingness. We think of outer space as a huge void, hostile to human life. A person who is spaced out is blank, unfocused, not really there. But the space in and around a work of art is not a void, and it is very much there. It is a dynamic visual element that interacts with the lines and shapes and colors and textures of a work of art to give them definition. Consider space in this way. How would there be a line if there were not the spaces on either side of it to mark its edges? How could there be a shape without the space around it to set it off? Three-dimensional space. Sculpture, architecture, and all other forms with mass exist in three-dimensional space, that is, the actual space in which our bodies also stand. These works of art take their character form from the ways in which they carve out volumes of space within and around them. The sculptor Alberto Giacometti was fascinated by how we perceive objects in space. He was intent on finding ways to suggest in his work the space he sensed between himself and his model, and also to situate his own sculptures in space for the viewers. The nose, he went so far as to frame a cubic volume of space around his disturbing sculpture of a head. The image was prompted by a visit Giacometti paid to a friend in the hospital. As Giacometti looked down at his friend's face, gaunt and washed with illness, it seemed to him that the eyes and cheeks were sinking farther down, and that the bony nose was growing longer. He captured that momentary vision of death in this sculpture, which he has suspended in space like a hanged man, or like a shrunken head, in an ethnographic museum. Architecture in particular can be thought of as a means of shaping space. Without the walls and ceiling of a room, space would be limitless. With them, space suddenly has boundaries and therefore volume, whereas from the outside we appreciate a work of architecture for its sculptural masses, from the inside we experience it as a shaped space or sequence of shaped spaces. Du Hossu's installation reflection produces a heightened awareness of shaped space it has occupied by modifying that space in an unexpected and disorienting way. Reflection consists of two identical replicas, the traditional Korean entry gate that stood before the artist's childhood home, made of blue nylon stretched over a framework of slender steel tubing. The meticulously detailed gates are translucent, allowing us to see into and through them. Sue sets them base to base in mirror image on a taut field of blue nylon mesh that bisects the space of the room horizontally. Entering visitors are confronted with an inverted, suspended gate, a reflection that seems more real, more present than the gate it reflects, which rises upright into the space above, softened and blurred by the blue haze of nylon field. Reflection is about memory, a gate and the memory of a gate, time present and time past, though which is which and where we are in relation to the two are difficult to say. Implied space, suggesting depth in two dimensions. Architecture, sculpture, and other art forms that exist in three dimensions work with actual space. When we view the work, we inhabit the same space it does, and we need to walk around it and or through it to experience it completely. With painting, drawing, and other two-dimensional art forms, the actual space is the flat surface of the work itself, which we tend to see all at once. Yet on this literal surface called the picture plane, other qualities and dimensions of space can be implied. For example, if you take an ordinary notebook page and draw a tiny dog in the center, the page has suddenly become a large space, a field for the dog to roam about in. If you draw a dog that takes up the entire page, the page has become a much smaller space, just big enough for the dog. Suppose now that you draw two dogs and perhaps a tree, and you want to show that where they are in relation to one another. One dog is behind the tree, say, and the other is running toward it from a distance. These relationships take place in the third dimension, depth. There are many visual clues that we use to perceive spatial relationships in depth. One of the simplest is overlap. We understand that when two forms overlap, the one we perceive as complete is in front of the one we perceive as partial. A second visual cue is position. Seated at a desk, for example, we look down to see the objects closest to us and raise our head up to see objects that are farther away. Many artistic cultures have relied entirely on those two basic cues to imply depth and dimension. In this lively scene of acrobats and musicians performing before an Indian prince, we understand that the performers toward the bottom of the page are nearer to us than ones higher up, and that the overlapping elephants and horses are standing next to each other in a row that recedes away from us. The most important person in the scene is the prince, and the painting makes this clear. Framed by the architectural setting, he sits amid his courtiers and attendants, all of whom are looking at him. The prince, too, is depicted in profile and does not seem to be watching the performance, yet this seeming inattention is not to be taken literally. The prince would certainly have watched such a wonderful event. Indian artists have favored profile views, for they give the least information about depth, and so lend themselves well to the overall flatness of Indian painting. Linear perspective. The sense of space in the Indian painting is conceptually convincing, but not optically convincing. For example, we understand perfectly well that the prince's pavilion is on the distant side of the acrobats, but there is actually no evidence to tell our eyes that it is not hovering in the air directly over them. Similarly, we understand that the elephant and horses represent rounded forms, even though they appear to our eyes as flat shapes, fanned out like a deck of cards on the picture plane. Together, the flatness of Indian painting, the preference for profiles, the use of saturated colors, and the conceptual construction of space make up a coherent system for depicting the world. They work together to give Indian artists tremendous flexibility in assembling complex, vivid, and visually delightful scenes such as this one, while while preserving narrative clarity. The chiaroscuro technique developed by Indian artists of the 15th century also forms part of a larger system for depicting the world. Just as the Renaissance artists took note of the optical evidence of light and shadow to model rounded forms, they also develop a technique for constructing an optically convincing space to set those forms in. This technique, called linear perspective, is based in the systematic application of two observations. Forms seem to diminish in size as they recede from us. Parallel lines receding into the distance seem to converge until they meet at a point on the horizon line where they disappear. This point is known as the vanishing point. You can visualize this second idea if you remember gazing down a straight highway. As the highway recedes farther from you, the two edges seem to draw closer together until they disappear at the horizon line. The development of linear perspective profoundly changes how artists view the picture plane. For medieval European artists, as for Indian artists, a painting was primarily a flat surface covered with shapes and colors. For Renaissance artists, it became a window onto a scene. The picture plane was reconceived as a sort of window pane, and the painted view was imagined as receding from it into the distance. Renaissance artists took up linear perspective with as much delight as a child takes up a new toy. Many paintings were created for no other reason than to show off the possibilities of this new technique. Here, the lines of the stone pavement lay bare the mechanics of linear perspective. We can actually observe the receding lines growing closer and can easily continue them in our imagination until they converge at a central point on the horizon where the sea meets the sky. The roof lines of various buildings converge at the same point, as do the lines that divide the ceiling of the covered portico in the immediate foreground. Leonardo da Vinci used linear perspective to construct a very similar space for his portrayal of the Last Supper. It was above all the measurable quality of the space created through linear perspective that intrigued Renaissance artists. Here, regular divisions of the ceiling measure out the recession just as the regular divisions of the pavement did in the preceding example. Painting on a monastery wall in Milan, the Last Supper depicts the final gathering of Jesus Christ with his disciples. The Passover meal they shared before Jesus was brought to trial and crucified. Leonardo captured a particular moment in the story, as related in the Gospel of Matthew in the Bible. Jesus, shown at the center of the composition, has just said to his followers, "One of you shall betray me." The disciples, Matthew tells us, were exceeding sorrowful, and began every one of them to say unto him, "Lord, is it I?" In Leonardo's portrayal, each of the disciples reacts differently to the terrible prediction. Some are shocked, some dismayed, some puzzled, but only Judas, knows that indeed it is he. Falling back from Jesus' words, the traitor Judas, seated forth from the left, with his elbow on the table, clutches a bag containing 30 pieces of silver, his price for handing over his leader to the authorities. To show this fateful moment, Leonardo places the group in a large banquet hall, his architectural space constructed in careful perspective. Cloth hanging on the side walls and panels in the ceiling are drawn so as to recede into space. Their lines converge at a vanishing point behind Jesus' head at the exact center of the picture. Thus, our attention is directed forcefully toward the most important part of the composition, the face of Jesus. The central opening in the back wall, a rectangular window, also helps to focus our attention on Jesus and creates a halo effect around his head. In the hands of the great artist, perspective became a vehicle for meaning, just as any other visual element. Here, for example, it is correct to say that the space is constructed so that the lines converge at a vanishing point in the distance behind Christ's head. But if we view the painting as a flat surface, we see that these lines can also be interpreted as radiating from Christ's head, as all creation radiates from the mind of God. Leonardo has purposely minimized Christ's shoulders so that his arms, too, take part in the system of radiating lines. Spreading his hands, then, God opens space to this moment which he had foreseen since the beginning of time. Foreshortening. The pictorial space to be consistent, the logic of linear perspective must apply to every form that recedes into the distance, including objects and humans and animal forms. This effect is called foreshortening. You can understand the challenge presented by foreshortening by closing one eye, pointing upward with your index finger in front of your open eye. Gradually lift your hand until your index finger is pointing away from you and you are staring directly down its length and into the distance. You know that your finger has not changed in length, and yet it appears much shorter. Much shorter than it did with it when it was upright. It appears foreshortened. Hans Balding Green portrays two foreshortened figures in The Groom and the Witch. The groom, lying perpendicular to the picture plane, is foreshortened. If we were to shift him so that he lay parallel to the picture plane, with his head to the left and his feet to the right, we would have to stretch him back out. The horse, standing at a 45-degree angle to the picture plane, is also foreshortened, with the distance between his rump and his forequarters compressed by the odd angle at which we see him. Foreshortening presented great difficulties to artists, for the complex organic masses of a horse or a man do not offer the simple receding lines of architecture. Hans Baldung Green's teacher, Albrecht Dürer, left us this wonderful image of an artist wrestling logically with the problem of extreme foreshortening. From our point of view, the woman lies parallel to the picture plane. From the point of view of the artist, however, she is directly perpendicular to it. Her knees are closest to him, her head farthest away. He has actually constructed a picture plane in the form of a gridded window through which he looks at his model. On the table before him lies a sheet of paper gridded to match. Standing on the table within the embrace of his arms is an obelisk whose tip just reaches his eye. The obelisk serves to focus his glance, making sure that every time he returns his gaze to the model, it is at the exact same height. Our artist will work slowly back and forth, looking across the tip of the obelisk with one eye open. He will observe his model through the grid. Looking down, he will open both eyes and quickly draw from memory what he saw. Using the grid lines as reference points, looking up again, he will refocus one eye on the model over the obelisk and memorize another small bit. Glance by glance, he will complete the drawing. Dürer's image illustrates well the strengths and drawbacks of linear perspective. It is a scientifically accurate system for rendering space and relationships within space as we perceive them, standing in one fixed place, with one eye open, staring at fixed points along one eye level. But in life we have two eyes, not one, and they are always in motion. Nevertheless, the principle of linear perspective dominated Western views of space for almost 500 years, and they continue to influence us through images generated by the camera, which also shows the view seen by one eye, the lens, staring at a point on a fixed level, the center focus. Atmospheric perspective. Staring off into a series of hills, you may notice that each succeeding range appears paler, bluer, and less distinct. This is an optical effect caused by the atmosphere that interposes itself between us and the objects we perceive. Particles of moisture and dust suspended in the atmosphere scatter light. Of all the colors of the spectrum, blue scatters the most. Hence the sky itself appears to be blue and things take on a bluish tinge in their distance from us as their distance from us increases. The first European artist to apply this observation systematically was Leonardo da Vinci, who called the effect aerial perspective. A more common term today is atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is the third and final element of the optically based system for representing the world that was developed during the Renaissance. For as long as naturalism remained a goal of Western art, these three techniques, modeling form through value, constructing space with linear perspective, and suggesting receding landscapes through atmospheric perspective, remain central to painting. John Frederick Kinsett's view of Lake George is an exquisite example of beautifully modulated atmospheric perspective. With its rocky outcropping, fallen tree trunk, green leaves, and water grasses, the shore in the foreground is clear and detailed. Small islands nearby are less distinct, but the trees are still green. Marking our progression into the distance, the three hills along the farther shores grow progressively more hazy and tinged with blue, which takes over completely as the farthest hill follows the curve of the lake away from us and disappears from view. Chinese and Japanese painters also relied on atmospheric perspective to suggest broad vistas of receding landscape. In Shinzu's autumn colors among streams and mountains, the gentle hills along the shore are built up from layers of contour strokes, anchored by local gray washes and detailed with barren tree trunks and black dots indicating foliage. The mountains that rise in the distance, in contrast, are simply rendered in washes of pale gray ink. The colors of the title are left to the viewer's imagination. Autumn colors among streams and mountains is an example of a hand scroll, an intimate format of painting developed in China. Small enough to be held in the hands, as the name indicates, a hand scroll was commonly only a foot or so in height, but many feet long. Autumn colors among streams and mountains, for example, is about 8 inches in height and just over 21 feet long. We illustrate only a small section of it. Hand scrolls were not displayed completely unrolled, as today we might see them in museums. Rather, they were kept rolled up and taken out for viewing only occasionally. Viewers would savor the painting only slowly, setting it on a table and unrolling a foot or two at a time. Working their way from one end of the scroll to the other, they journeyed through a landscape that commonly alternated stretches of open water and lowlands with hills and mountains. In Autumn Colors Among Streams and Mountains, Shinzu paid homage to the quartet of painters known as the Four Masters of the Yuan dynasty by imitating their styles one after the other, and added pleasure for cultivated viewers. Isometric perspective. As we have seen, the converging lines of linear perspective are based on the fixed viewpoint of an earthbound viewer. The viewpoint in Chinese painting, however, is typically mobile and airborne, and so converging lines have no place in their system of representation. Islamic painting often employs an aerial viewpoint as well, so that scenes are depicted in their totality as God might see and understand them, to suggest regular forms such as a building receding from the picture plane. Chinese and Muslim painters use diagonal lines, but without allowing parallels to converge. This system is known as isometric perspective. In the page illustrated here from a manuscript of the Sulaymanama history of Suleiman, the blue and white fortress in the background is portrayed using isometric perspective. The side walls recede to the right in parallel diagonal lines. The rear wall is as wide as the wall nearest us. Suleiman was a famous Ottoman sultan in the 16th century. Toward the end of his reign, his official history was written by the poet Arifi, transcribed by a famous calligrapher, and lavishly illustrated by court artists. Time and motion. Time and motion have always been linked to art, if only because time is the element in which we live and motion is the very sign of life. It was only during the 20th century, however, that time and motion truly took their places as elements of Western art, and this for the simple reason that through advances in science and technology, daily life itself became far more dynamic, and the nature of time in relationship to space and universe more a matter for thought. During the 1930s, the American artist Alexander Calder set sculpture in motion with works that came to be called mobiles. Constructed from abstract forms suspended on slender lengths of wire, they responded by their own weight to the lightest currents of air. Calder also created works he called stabiles, sculptures that did not move but sat still on the ground like everyone else's. Only he combined the two ideas, as here in his monumental Southern Cross, where an orange stabile holds aloft a black mobile. Southern Cross is the popular name for a constellation called Crux, visible in the southern hemisphere. Sailors on the southern seas used to steer by it. Calder's mobile constellation seems to be made of pieces of night, and his stabile looks suspiciously capable of movement, as though it might skitter away on its pointy legs. Art that moves is called kinetic art, from the Greek word kinetos, moving, from the Greek word kinetos, moving. Calder is considered to be one of its founders, but motion in the experience of art is not confined to the artworks themselves. As viewers, we also move, walking around and under Calder's Southern Cross, for example, to experience what it looks like from different distances and angles. We walk through architecture to explore its spaces. We draw near to and away from paintings to notice details or allow them to blur back into the whole. As we saw in Chapter 2, artists of the 20th century became increasingly conscious of the viewer's motion over time, especially in the context of gallery and museum spaces. In works such as Inside Out, Richard Serra creates sculpture that is both an object for us to look at and a place for us to explore. I've learned a great deal from looking at and walking through architecture, Serra has said. It has enabled me to understand space in relation to movement. Inside Out partakes of the dual nature of architecture. From the outside, we view it as an object. From the inside, we experience it as shaped space. The plan of the sculpture is clear when seen from an elevated viewpoint, as the illustration here. But to viewers approaching the sculpture on foot, the plan is hidden, for the work is over 13 feet tall. Inside Out confronts us as curved steel wall like a fortress or the hull of a ship. Circling it, we eventually happen on a pair of openings. The gentler, more inviting one brings us to a rounded clearing, but no further. The more forbidding opening takes us on a journey down a narrow, winding canyon, towering walls to either side lean outward, then inward, continuously modifying the space and our physical experience of it. We can't know where we are going, what there is to discover, or even how we'll eventually get out. Nick Cave makes art that depends for its full effect on the motion of yet another potential participant, the performer. Cave makes sculptures that he calls sound suits. Although we can appreciate them in a gallery setting where they stand motionless before us, most of them are made to be worn and danced. Like masquerades, the great African art form, Cave's sound suits are art that is meant to be seen in motion. Sound suits take their name from the first one Cave made back during the racially tense times of the early 1990s. An amateur video documenting the brutal beating of an African American man by members of the Los Angeles police force had been widely shown on the news media. Riots broke out in several cities after a jury acquitted 3 of the 4 officers involved. I started thinking about myself more and more as a black man, Cave recalls, as someone who is discarded, devalued, viewed as less than. Sitting one day on a park bench, he began to consider the twigs that lay on the ground around him as similarly rejected, valueless things. He gathered up armfuls of them and brought them back to his studio, where he cut them into 3-inch lengths and wired them to a bodysuit he had made, completely covering it from head to toe. Cave had intended the work as a sculpture, but he immediately realized that he could wear it. I put it on and jumped around and was amazed. It was this fabulous wrestling around, and because it was so heavy, I had to stand very erect, and that alone brought the idea of dance back into my head. Just as important, Cave realized he could disappear into the suit, and no one could tell from the outside whether he was black, white, orange, or purple. Since that initial impulse to give form to feelings in the face of events, Cave has created hundreds of sound suits using scavenged materials and items purchased from thrift shops, flea markets, and garage sales. They dance before us, a race of joyous, mysterious, silly, mournful, disturbing, majestic, extravagant beings that make their own music. We could put one on and join in. The Greek word kinetos also gives us the word cinema, certainly the most significant new art form of the 20th century. Film and later video provided artists with new ways to work with time and motion. As these technologies become increasingly affordable and available, artists experimented with them more and more, to the point where video became as important a medium for contemporary art. More recently, digital animation technology has allowed artists to create videos that do not necessarily rely on camera images. A beautiful example is Jennifer Steinkamp's installation, Dervish. The installation was named for the order of Sufi mystics, known in English as whirling dervishes, who enter into a state of spiritual ecstasy by means of a spinning dance. Dervish consisted of 4 digitally animated images of trees, each called Dervish, projected onto the walls of a darkened room. The photograph here shows 2 of the trees. Each individual branch, leaf, and blossom seemed alive as the trees twirled slowly, first one way and then the other, their virtual roots holding firm in the virtual ground, their trunks twisting like wrung laundry. Even more magically, each tree cycled through the seasons as it swayed, with spring blossoms giving way to summer foliage, then autumn colors, then bare branches. To create her trees, Steinkamp began with an image of a maple. She modified each element digitally until she had created a tree that resembled no known tree at all, a completely artificial and virtual tree. Her only rule in her art, she says, is that everything must be simulated. Each dervish can be programmed to display whatever season the viewer is in the mood for, or to change seasons on cue. The sound of a slamming door, for example, could cause spring to turn into summer. With strategies such as these, many digital artists surrender ultimate control over their creations. Line, shape, mass, light, value, color, texture, pattern, space, time, and motion. These are the raw materials, the elements of a work of art. To introduce them, we have had to look at each one individually, examining its role in various works of art. But in fact, we do not perceive the elements one at a time, but together, and almost any given work of art is not an example of one element, but of many. In the next chapter, we examine how artists organize these elements into art, how this organization structures our experience of looking, and how understanding of the visual elements and their organization can help us see more fully. That, my friends, is the end of chapter 4. Again, I apologize for not being the greatest of reader. I'm just doing this so that if you need to listen to it as you drive or as you do other work, you can, and maybe in some way that might be helpful to you. I do encourage you to read the chapters on your own, or go back and look at parts of it on your own, and to definitely look at the pictures as these chapters are being read to you. Alright, it is time for you to go and read chapter 5. I'll try and get that video up shortly.